Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila again, and I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to do a story for you last week, but I just didn't feel real good. But tonight, I have another story for you. Our story tonight is called War Orphans. Do you know what an orphan is? An orphan is a child that its parents had died. Well, this is a sad and a happy story. There was a young man who was in the army. It was 1943, toward the end of World War II. Well, this young soldier, he was a medic. And what he did was he took care of the wounded. Anybody that got shot or injured for any reason, he would take care of them. He and the other men in his unit had been sent out. And part of the reason they were sent into German territory was they were to learn about the enemy, so they could come back and report to their supervisor, so they would know better how to take care of things there in that war. Well, it had been a horribly hard day. They had fought really hard, and the medic, he had used everything out of his medic bag. It was totally empty. There was no more bandages. There was no more medicine. There was no more plasma to give people that were bleeding. And the soldiers, that fight was over. So the American soldiers made their way back to their camp. It was called a line camp. The medic and the other soldiers took turns carrying the wounded men back to the line camp. And there were 2 soldiers that had died. They carried them back as well. Oh. The medic, he sat down. He was so sad. Those 2 young men that had died, he felt the worst about them because they had just joined their unit, and today was their very first assignment, and they were both 20 years old and had died. Well, his shoulders ached and his back ached from carrying all those heavy men back. But it was all over now. So he made his way with one of his friends to the tent that was the cafeteria. And he sat down wearily to eat his supper. When he'd eaten all he could, he took his plate and he went outside. Now, out there were 2 big garbage cans for dumping anything that you didn't eat in. But then he saw them. 5 little German children. Anywhere from 3, 4, 5. There were 2 girls and 3 boys. And what he saw just about made him cry. In their hands, each of those little children had a can, kind of like a vegetable can or something. It had been washed out. And each child had one of those cans in each hand. And they were standing there by that big garbage can, waiting. What they were waiting for was that the American soldiers had always been kind to them. And what the soldiers would do is they would scrape off their plate all the food that was left into those little children's cans, because that's all the food they had to eat. Now, some of the soldiers, they would always give any of the children that were out there with their little cans, they would always give them part of their food. And sometimes the soldiers didn't eat as much as they probably would have wanted to have eaten, so they could give the different orphan children something to eat. Well, the medic, he took his plate over. He'd had spaghetti and meatballs and bread. He wished he had more when he saw those children. He put some in each of their little cans. Then he went over to the littlest girl. As he looked at her, he knelt down and he stuck out his hands to her, but she looked at him frightened. And he said, "It's okay. It's all right." And then, in her language, he started to talk to her. "It's okay. Are you hungry?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "You look cold. Are you cold?" "I'm hungry and I'm cold." He looked at her, and when she said she was hungry, he reached in his pocket. You know, soldiers' pants and shirts have lots of pockets for good reason. And he pulled out a candy bar, a chocolate candy bar, all wrapped up in its wrapper, and he handed it to her. And she looked at him, and she set her two little cans down, and with both arms she wrapped them around that medic, and she held him, and she looked up at him, and she said, "I love you." Well, the soldier by this time was crying. Well, now he knew that the children would come. He always made sure that he had some food to give them. And they didn't have shoes, they just had rags to wrap around their feet. And it was very cold, it was winter time. So he did as much as he could do. And you know, the more he saw those little children, he realized something. All 5 of them looked exactly alike. Why do you suppose that is? Because they were brothers and sisters. Let's speed ahead to 1959. That's 16 years later from the time he met those little children standing out in the cold and that were so hungry. Well, during that period of time, from 1943, somewhere right close to the end of the war, this medic, an American soldier, had made arrangements to adopt those 5 children so they wouldn't be orphans anymore. And her knew what was going to be the little girl's grandfather. He made all the arrangements so that when the soldier was going to fly home, I'm sorry, he didn't get to fly. He came home in a boat, but he wasn't alone. All those 5 children were with him. Well, their new mommy hadn't even met them yet. But all the children felt that God had done something wonderful when he made sure that all 5 of those little children were at the line camp that night when that medic was there. Well, now, as I say, it was 1959, and that little girl was no longer little. She was going to graduate. And pretty soon the graduates all marched down the aisle to Pomp and Circumstance, which is the song that they always play for graduates. And up front, the principal and all the teachers and all the important people were seated. And this graduating class marched up onto that podium. The vice principal of the school, he stood up and he put out his hands. He said, "Please, everybody stand up. We're going to have prayer before we start." So he prayed. And then the guest speaker got up and he did his talk or his sermon, and it was very good. And then it was time for the valedictorian to speak. And it was Gretchen, that little girl from Germany. And she stood up at the podium. The principal of the school, he had announced that she was the only student that they'd had that year. She was an A student. She had all A's. Well, of course, all the people in the audience clapped loudly. And Gretchen, you know, there's certain things that the valedictorian has to talk about. But one of the things she talked about was the fact that that was a Christian school and how she had learned all about God there and how kind everybody had been and how the teachers were always there to help you. Well, when she finished talking about the school, she said, "I have something else to say." One of the brothers stood up with his trumpet to play, and one of the sisters went over to the piano to play, and they played beautifully together, just like this was something that they'd always done. And then 2 of the brothers were asked to come up, and they sang together beautifully. And then the girls sang. Gretchen turned to the audience, and she asked her mother and her father to come up to the podium, and her brothers and sisters, and they all stood in a line. And Gretchen, she hugged each of her brothers and sisters. Then she went to her new mother, and she gave her a kiss on the cheek, and she gave her a bouquet of red roses. Well, then she turned to her father, that medic from so long ago, and she smiled at him. And once again, she said to him, "I love you." And then she added the word he wanted to hear, "Daddy." He couldn't help but cry, and neither could the mother and the other children. Now they were one big, happy family. And then Gretchen turned to her father, And she handed him a little package. And he slowly opened it. When he'd taken off the wrapping, what he saw inside made him cry all the more, because it was one uneaten chocolate bar. And underneath of it was a carefully folded wrapper from that chocolate bar that she had shared with her brothers and sisters all those years ago during the Second World War. And she said to her daddy, I wanted you to have a chocolate bar because I knew you loved us and you were so self-sacrificing to share, and you've given us a home, and we all love you. And the audience stood up and they clapped and they clapped and they clapped. The daddy said, this all reminds me of my Heavenly Father, who sacrificed by giving his Son so that all of us, and he named their children. I'm going to give you the names. Gretchen, Hans, Helga, Siegfried, and Luther. And the mommy's name was Mary. He said all the children's names, and he said, it reminds me of what our Heavenly Father has done for all of us. And he hugged every one of them. And he said, I am sure that God arranged that I could be back from patrol that night and at the line camp when all 5 of these children had come together. And that's when I fell in love with them, just like God's fallen in love with us. Thank you, boys and girls, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye now.